what he calls inner landscapes, all of them unreal. I mean, when Pessoa uses the words real and unreal, they're pretty interchangeable, because in some sense he thinks these landscapes that the rest of us would call unreal are the prior reality. They're actually more real. He says, some of my friends live in the rural towns and villages of a Portugal inside me. They come to the city, where I sometimes run into them, and I open wide my arms with emotion when I meet them. And of course, all of this, he's dreaming, pacing in my room, talking out loud, gesticulating, throwing my arms out wide. He occasionally, as you know, complains about noise that he hears from the other people living in his building. But if he's walking up and down, talking out loud, and embracing these friends from the country, I don't think he can really complain about noisy neighbors. He emphasizes again and again the uniqueness of all these characters and landscapes to his own soul. They only exist in whatever enigmatic way they do exist, in or through him, Pessoa, the person, the poet. Yet, in spite of this, or perhaps because of it, he suffers from a strange inability to reconnect with the denizens of his imagined past, and especially of his childhood. Some of the most painful passages for me in Pessoa are he's thinking back to his childhood, he's remembering his childhood, and it seems in some way to him dead. It seems in some sense inaccessible. This is a theme in Nietzsche that comes up in Das Volk Zarathustra a lot, so I'll show you in just a minute. And so he calls the most painful form of nostalgia, he calls that the nostalgia for things that never existed, things that he dreamed or imagined as a child. And there's a remarkable parallel here, because it's not clear whether, I'm assuming Nietzsche, I'm assuming Pessoa did not read Zarathustra, but I don't know, does Bartholomew, do we know?
Yeah.
He did?
Yes, he did.
He did read?
Yes.
Okay.
Spanish version.
Okay. So in that case, I think we have here a borrowing from that wonderful text, because there's a real parallel in there, both Nietzsche and Nietzsche through Zarathustra, both Pessoa and they become the same person, or the same multitude of persons for me. The parallel between Pessoa and Nietzsche speaking through Zarathustra on this issue, because at the beginning of the Grave Song is a very important song for this, Zarathustra sings, "O you visions and apparitions of my youth, O all you glances of love, you divine moments, how quickly you died away. I remember you today as my deceased." And the fact that they're göttliche Augenblicke, they're divine moments, plays a really important role in the thought of eternal recurrence later on. But he seems to be in the same situation as Pessoa, because these divine moments, these memories from his childhood in Röcken and in Naumburg, have died away, and he remembers them mourning, remembers them as deceased. And Pessoa writes about, he says, "My bitterness over nostalgia's impotence to revive and resurrect becomes a tearful rage against God." Not someone whom Pessoa seems to believe in, but God is now sort of responsible for this forgetting, for this inability to reconnect with those figures. This tearful rage against God, because he created, quote, "the dead past that survives in me and that has never been anywhere but in me." And this is an interesting question to which I don't have the answer, so I put it out as not as a rhetorical question, but as a real question, because I will write the answer down if we come to it later. That's interesting, because if these persons are accessible through his soul, why can't he reconnect with them? what's preventing him? It's not God's fault. I mean, yes, in some sense they die, but I don't see what would be the difference between these imagined figures, imagined in childhood and imagined in last night's dreaming or last night's reverie or yesterday's fantasy. The end of the grave song in Zarathustra goes like this. He's talking about how his enemies killed these divine moments. And for me, I think that's a combination of people who told him, stop making things up as a child, that's just your imagination, that's not real, that's fantasy. And also it's clear from some of the language that he uses that it has to do with Wagner and Cosima and some of those particular real enemies as they became to him. And he talks about how deeply this has wounded his soul. How did I make use of and overcome such wounds? How did my soul rise again from these graves? Yes, something invulnerable, unburiable is within me, something that explodes rock. That is my will. Silently it strides and unchanging through the years. And a couple of lines later, to this day, he's now addressing his will, to this day you live and stay self-same, most patient one. To this day you continue to break through all graves, and only where there are graves are there resurrections. And that's a very important line, very important lines, I think, in Nietzsche, because, of course, like Pessoa, I'll come on to this in a moment, everything is in flux, everything is becoming, there's nothing but arising and perishing, and yet, at one level, there's nothing is the same, except the will lives and stays self-same. This will turn out to be the will that is will to power. Pessoa again. It is a genuine nostalgia that I feel, an actual past that I mourn, a real life corpse that I stare at, lying solidly in its coffin. And it seems to me that what we have in Zarathustra is a way to break through that coffin, to resurrect the corpse. And talk of resurrection is obviously the resurrection is a religious category, and we see how important this is for Nietzsche in a section 20 of part 2 of Zarathustra on redemption. Erlösung is an absolutely central religious category and absolutely central to Zarathustra, being able to think the thought of eternal recurrence. Okay, so there it is, the past, a real life corpse for Pessoa, interesting kind of corpse, that I stare at lying solemnly in its coffin. Yes, the past appears to be dead and gone, and the results of all our striving come to naught. And as for the future, again, nothing, the nothingness of death. It all seems pretty hopeless, enough to make one turn to Schopenhauer, which I'll do in just a minute. So that coffin of Pessoa's appears in a dream. I said just like Pessoa's, but maybe the same coffin if Pessoa read this. Appears in a dream that Zarathustra dreams just before his insight into the way to resurrect the past, to resurrect the corpses of the past. And this is on the 19th. It's called The Soothsayer, and is very obviously Schopenhauer. And it opens with these Schopenhauerian words. And I saw a great mournfulness come over humankind. The best became weary of their works. A teaching went forth, and a belief along with it. All is empty, all is the same, all has been. And this is Schopenhauer, the Buddha of Frankfurt, Schopenhauer and the Buddhism that Nietzsche rejected because it was nihilistic. and European nihilism, the European form of nihilism, was the form of nihilism that had to be overcome. So passive nihilism, negative, useless, paralyzing, that we see being overcome in I suppose, Zarathustra. Here's the dream, later in that section. All life, and here Nietzsche, you remember, tells the dream to his disciples and asks them for some interpretations, which he then ignores. All life I had renounced, thus did I dream. A night and grave watchman I had become in the lonely mountain castle of death. Up there I guarded his coffins. The musty vaults stood filled with such signs of his victory. From within glass coffins, life that had been overcome looked out at me. I'm sorry, maybe I should be reading this in German, which I could do, but it would take too long. But anyway, it's not a bad translation.